On the night of May 20th, 1989, Captain Alexander Zuyev did something that would change the course of Cold War aviation history forever. At precisely 2:47 in the morning, under the cover of complete darkness at Chakaya Air Base in Soviet Georgia, he climbed into the cockpit of a MiG-29 Fulcrum, one of the most advanced fighter jets the Soviet Union had ever produced. What happened next would expose a critical vulnerability that NATO would exploit for the next 12 years, a vulnerability that the Soviets had desperately tried to keep secret. This is the story of how one man's decision to defect revealed that the fearsome MiG-29, the pride of Soviet aviation, was essentially blind at night. If you find this story as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We bring you incredible true stories from history that you won't hear anywhere else. Now let's continue with this remarkable tale. The MiG-29 was supposed to be the Soviet answer to the American F-15 and F-16 fighters. When Western intelligence first caught glimpses of this aircraft in satellite imagery during the early 1980s, there was genuine concern in Pentagon corridors. The sleek twin-engine fighter with its distinctive air intakes and impressive maneuverability appeared to be a genuine threat to NATO air superiority. American pilots, who had trained against simulated Soviet tactics, knew that if war ever broke out in Europe, they would likely face this aircraft in combat. But what NATO didn't know, what they couldn't possibly know without getting their hands on an actual MiG-29, was that this feared fighter had a fatal flaw built into its very design. The aircraft's radar system, the N019 Rubin, was significantly inferior to what Western analysts had assumed. More critically, the cockpit instrumentation and avionics made effective night operations nearly impossible for Soviet pilots. To understand how we got to that fateful night in 1989, we need to go back to the beginning of Alexander Zuyev's story. Born in 1961 in the industrial city of Samara, then known as Kuibyshev, Alexander grew up in a typical Soviet household. His father worked at an aircraft manufacturing plant, which perhaps planted the seed of his fascination with flight. From a young age, Alexander dreamed of becoming a fighter pilot, one of the most prestigious careers a young Soviet man could aspire to. He excelled in school, particularly in mathematics and physics, subjects that would serve him well in his future career. At 18, he was accepted into the Armavir Higher Military Aviation School for Pilots, one of the premier flight training institutions in the Soviet Union. Here, Alexander would spend the next 4 years learning to fly, studying military tactics, and being indoctrinated in Soviet ideology. The training was brutal. Cadets were pushed to their physical and mental limits. They flew in all weather conditions, practiced combat maneuvers until they became second nature, and memorized countless procedures and protocols. Alexander thrived in this environment. His instructors noted his exceptional situational awareness and his ability to remain calm under pressure. By the time he graduated in 1983, he had logged over 300 flight hours and was considered one of the most promising young pilots in his class. His first assignment was to a regiment flying the older MiG-23 Flogger. The MiG-23 was a capable aircraft, but it was already showing its age by the mid-1980s. Alexander flew it competently, but he longed to fly the newer, more advanced aircraft he had heard rumors about. That opportunity came in 1987 when he was selected to transition to the MiG-29. The transition training was intense. The MiG-29 was a different beast entirely from the MiG-23. It was more maneuverable, faster, and equipped with more advanced systems. Alexander spent 3 months learning every system, every procedure, every quirk of the aircraft. He flew dozens of training sorties, gradually mastering the Fulcrum's unique handling characteristics. But as he became more familiar with the aircraft, Alexander began to notice things that troubled him. The MiG-29's vaunted capabilities, which were constantly praised in Soviet media and military publications, didn't quite match the reality he experienced in the cockpit. The radar system was unreliable, often losing track of targets or providing inaccurate information. The cockpit displays were crude compared to what he had seen in photographs of Western aircraft. And most troublingly, night operations were essentially impossible without extensive ground control assistance. The Soviet military had developed a system where ground controllers would guide pilots to their targets using radar information relayed from ground stations. This system worked reasonably well during daylight hours, but at night, pilots were essentially flying blind. The MiG-29's cockpit was not designed for low-light operations. The instrument lighting was poor, the head-up display was rudimentary, and there was no terrain-following radar or forward-looking infrared system that would allow pilots to navigate safely in darkness. Alexander kept these observations to himself initially. Criticizing Soviet military equipment was not something one did lightly in the 1980s, but he began to quietly document what he saw, noting the discrepancies between official capabilities and actual performance in a small notebook he kept hidden in his quarters. Meanwhile, the political situation in the Soviet Union was changing rapidly. Mikhail Gorbachev had come to power in 1985 and had initiated his policies of glasnost and perestroika. For the first time in decades, Soviet citizens could speak more openly about problems in their society. Some of Alexander's fellow officers began to quietly voice their own concerns about corruption in the military, about equipment that didn't work as advertised, about a system that valued political loyalty over competence. By 1988, Alexander had become deeply disillusioned with the Soviet system. He had seen fellow pilots killed in training accidents that could have been prevented with better equipment or maintenance. He had watched as competent officers were passed over for promotion in favor of those with better political connections, and he had come to believe that the entire Soviet military machine was built on a foundation of lies and deception. The idea of defection began to form in his mind. It was not a decision he made lightly. He had family in the Soviet Union, parents who would surely suffer consequences if he fled. He had friends, colleagues, a life built over nearly 30 years. But the more he thought about it, the more he became convinced that he could not continue to serve a system he had come to despise. He began to plan carefully. Defecting in a MiG-29 would be extraordinarily difficult. Soviet air bases were heavily guarded, and any unauthorized takeoff would immediately trigger a response from air defense systems. He would need to choose his moment carefully, find a gap in the defenses, and hope that he could reach friendly territory before being shot down. The opportunity came in May 1989. Alexander was stationed at Skakaya Air Base in the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic, close to the Turkish border. Turkey was a NATO member, and if he could reach Turkish airspace, he would be safe. The distance was approximately 200 kilometers, a journey that would take his MiG-29 less than 15 minutes at full afterburner. On the night of May 20th, everything seemed to align. The base was on a reduced alert status due to a holiday weekend. Many officers were away or celebrating, leaving fewer eyes watching the flight line. The weather was clear, with a good visibility for visual flight. And most importantly, Alexander had memorized the patrol patterns of the air defense radars and knew there would be a brief window when coverage would be minimal. At 2:30 in the morning, Alexander left his quarters and made his way to the flight line. He was supposed to be on the schedule for an early morning training flight, so his presence near the aircraft would not immediately raise suspicions. He found his assigned MiG-29 and began the pre-flight checks, his heart pounding but his hands steady. What happened next has been pieced together from various sources, including Alexander's own accounts given after his defection. As he was preparing to start the engines, a guard approached to check his authorization. Alexander, knowing that any delay could be fatal to his plan, made a split-second decision. He struck the guard, knocking him unconscious, and quickly climbed into the cockpit. The base immediately went on alert. Alexander heard shouts behind him as he brought the engines to life. The twin Klimov RD-33 turbofans roared as he pushed the throttles forward, taxiing toward the runway at a speed far faster than normal. Procedures allowed. Behind him, he could see soldiers running toward vehicles, and he knew that interceptors would be scrambling within minutes. He reached the runway and didn't bother waiting for clearance. Pushing the throttles to maximum afterburner, the MiG-29 accelerated rapidly, pressing Alexander back into his ejection seat. The aircraft lifted off after what seemed like an impossibly short distance, and Alexander immediately began climbing and turning toward the southwest, toward Turkey, toward freedom. The next few minutes were the longest of his life. He knew that Soviet air defense systems would be tracking him. that surface-to-air missiles could be launching at any moment, that other MiG-29's or Su-27's could be closing in from behind. He flew as low as he dared, trying to use terrain to mask his approach from radar, while simultaneously climbing enough to clear the mountains that lay between him and the Turkish border. He crossed into Turkish airspace at approximately 3:05 in the morning, less than 20 minutes after taking off. Turkish radar had been tracking an unknown aircraft approaching from the Soviet Union, and F-16s were scrambled to intercept. But Alexander had tuned his radio to the international emergency frequency and was broadcasting his intentions to defect. The F-16s escorted him to a Turkish airbase, where he landed safely just as the sun was beginning to rise. The immediate aftermath was chaotic. Turkish authorities secured the aircraft and took Alexander into custody for questioning. The Soviet Union immediately demanded the return of both the pilot and the aircraft, calling the incident an act of air piracy. But Turkey, as a NATO member, recognized the significance of what had just fallen into their lap. They had a MiG-29, one of the most advanced Soviet fighters, completely intact and ready for examination. Within hours, American intelligence officers were on their way to Turkey. The CIA had been trying to get detailed information about the MiG-29's capabilities for years. Satellite imagery could only tell them so much. What they really needed was access to an actual aircraft, and now they had one. The examination of Alexander's MiG-29 began almost immediately. Western technical experts descended on the Turkish airbase, eager to finally get their hands on the aircraft that had caused so much concern in NATO planning circles. What they found would fundamentally change their understanding of the Soviet threat. The first thing the experts noticed was the cockpit. Compared to contemporary Western fighters like the F-16 or F-18, the MiG-29's cockpit was remarkably primitive. The instrumentation was analog, with round dial gauges reminiscent of aircraft from the 1960s. The head-up display was basic, showing only essential flight and weapons information. Most crucially, there was no moving map display, no integrated systems management, and virtually no provisions for night flying. Western pilots who were allowed to sit in the cockpit were shocked. They had expected sophisticated Soviet technology, perhaps different from Western systems, but equally capable. Instead, they found an aircraft that required constant attention to multiple instruments, that demanded the pilot act as a systems manager in addition to actually flying and fighting. In a modern air combat environment, where information management was becoming as important as raw flying skill, this was a significant disadvantage, but it was the radar system that truly revealed the MiG-29's limitations. The N-19 Rubin radar, which Western analysts had assumed was roughly comparable to the AN/APG-65 radar used in the F-18, turned out to be significantly inferior. Its range was shorter than expected. Its ability to track multiple targets simultaneously was limited, and it was highly susceptible to electronic countermeasures. More critically for combat operations, the radar's look-down capability was poor. This meant that in any engagement where the MiG-29 was flying higher than its target, it would have difficulty detecting and tracking that target against the ground clutter. Western fighters had long since solved this problem, but the Soviet engineers had apparently struggled with the technology. Alexander himself proved to be an invaluable source of information. During weeks of debriefings, he provided detailed insights into Soviet pilot training, tactics, and operational procedures. He explained how Soviet pilots compensated for their aircraft's limitations, relying heavily on ground control intercept procedures rather than autonomous operations. He described the strict rules that limited pilot initiative, the rigid hierarchical structure that discouraged innovation, and the pervasive culture of secrecy that prevented pilots from learning from each other's experiences. But the most valuable information Alexander provided concerned the MiG-29's night fighting capabilities, or rather its lack thereof. He explained that Soviet MiG-29 pilots were essentially prohibited from conducting offensive operations at night without extensive ground control support. The aircraft simply wasn't equipped for it. There was no infrared search and track system for detecting targets without radar. The cockpit lighting was designed for daytime operations and actually impaired night vision. And the training curriculum included almost no night combat scenarios. This revelation was a game-changer for NATO planners. The entire Western strategy for defending against a Soviet air attack had been based on the assumption that the battle would be fought around the clock. NATO had invested heavily in night fighting capabilities, with aircraft like the F-15E Strike Eagle and the F-111 designed specifically for all-weather day-night operations. They had assumed the Soviets had made similar investments. Now they learned that the fearsome MiG-29, which was supposed to be the backbone of Soviet frontal aviation, was essentially a daytime-only fighter. In any conflict, NATO could gain a significant advantage by conducting major operations at night when the MiG-29's would be unable to effectively intercept attacking aircraft. The implications extended far beyond tactical considerations. NATO's entire air campaign planning for a potential conflict in Europe was revised based on this intelligence. Attack profiles that had been designed to minimize exposure to the MiG-29 threat were reconsidered. New tactics were developed to exploit the Soviet aircraft's night blindness. Training programs were updated to emphasize night operations even more heavily. But NATO didn't stop there. They also began developing electronic warfare systems specifically designed to exploit the NRU-19 radar's weaknesses. Knowing exactly how the radar worked, what frequencies it used, and what its processing limitations were allowed Western engineers to create countermeasures that would be devastatingly effective. The information from Alexander's defection was classified at the highest levels. NATO didn't want the Soviets to know exactly what they had learned, because that knowledge gave them a significant advantage. For the next several years, this intelligence shaped Western military planning, while the Soviets remained largely unaware of just how comprehensively their secrets had been revealed. Meanwhile, Alexander Zuyev began building a new life in the West. After his initial debriefings in Turkey, he was brought to the United States, where he was granted asylum. He lived under an assumed name for the first few years, while concerns about Soviet retaliation remained high. Eventually, he emerged from the shadows and began speaking publicly about his experiences. He wrote a book about his defection and his time as a Soviet pilot, providing a first-hand account of life in the Soviet military during its final years. He consulted for Western defense companies, offering insights into Soviet aircraft, design philosophy, and operational doctrine, and he became a symbol of the internal contradictions that were tearing the Soviet system apart. The timing of his defection proved to be historically significant in ways he could not have anticipated. Just 5 months after Alexander flew his MiG-29 to Turkey, the Berlin Wall fell. Within 2 years, the Soviet Union itself would collapse, ending the Cold War that had dominated global politics for nearly half a century. The collapse of the Soviet Union brought unexpected confirmation of what Alexander had revealed. As former Warsaw Pact countries joined NATO or established closer ties with the West, their Soviet-era equipment became available for examination. Germany, reunified after the fall of the Wall, inherited the East German Air Force, including its fleet of MiG-29's. German pilots who transitioned to flying the MiG-29 provided additional insights that confirmed and expanded on what Alexander had revealed. They praised the aircraft's dogfighting capabilities, its impressive thrust-to-weight ratio, and its ability to perform dramatic maneuvers. But they also confirmed its significant limitations in beyond-visual range combat, its poor situational awareness systems, and its inadequate night-fighting capability. The German MiG-29's became valuable training assets for NATO, allowing Western pilots to fly against the actual aircraft they might have faced in combat. These exercises repeatedly demonstrated that while the MiG-29 was dangerous in a close-in dogfight, Western fighters with their superior avionics and weapon systems held significant advantages in the type of beyond-visual range engagements that modern air combat doctrine emphasized. The night blindness that Alexander had revealed became even more apparent in actual combat operations. When NATO intervened in the Balkans during the 1990s, Serbian forces operated MiG-29's against the alliance. In virtually every engagement, the superior situational awareness and night-fighting capabilities of NATO aircraft proved decisive. Serbian MiG-29's were shot down with relative ease, often before their pilots even knew they were under attack. One particularly telling engagement occurred during Operation Allied Force in 1999. A Serbian MiG-29 was tracked by a Dutch F-16 during a night intercept mission. The F-16's radar detected the MiG at long range, and the Dutch pilot was able to position himself for an optimal missile shot. The Serbian pilot, hampered by his aircraft's inferior radar and cockpit systems, apparently never detected the F-16. He was killed when an AIM-120 AMRAAM missile struck his aircraft. This engagement, and others like it, demonstrated in deadly reality what Alexander's defection had revealed a decade earlier. The MiG-29, for all its impressive aerodynamic performance, was fundamentally limited by its avionics and systems integration. Against a well-trained Western pilot in a modern fighter with superior electronics, the MiG was at a severe disadvantage, especially at night or in conditions where beyond visual range combat predominated. The intelligence from Alexander's defection continued to influence Western military planning well into the 1990s. When American forces confronted Iraqi MiG-29's during the Gulf War in 1991, they did so with detailed knowledge of the aircraft's capabilities and limitations. The tactics developed based on Alexander's information proved effective, with Iraqi MiG-29's being destroyed without inflicting any losses on coalition aircraft. But Alexander's story was about more than just technical intelligence. It was also a deeply human tale of moral choice and personal sacrifice. By defecting, Alexander had given up everything familiar: his country, his family, his identity. He had taken an enormous risk, knowing that failure would mean death or imprisonment, and he had done so because he believed the system he served was fundamentally corrupt and dishonest. In interviews given years after his defection, Alexander reflected on what had driven his decision. He spoke of the cognitive dissonance he experienced as a young officer, being told constantly that Soviet equipment was the best in the world while seeing with his own eyes that this wasn't true. He described the frustration of watching talented pilots die in preventable accidents because proper safety protocols would have required admitting that equipment was defective. And he talked about his gradual realization that the entire Soviet system was built on a foundation of lies. His defection, he said, was ultimately an act of conscience. He believed that by revealing the truth about the MiG-29's capabilities, he might help prevent a war that neither side could win. If Western planners understood that the Soviet threat was not as overwhelming as they feared, perhaps the tensions that kept the world on the brink of nuclear annihilation might ease. Whether his actions contributed to the end of the Cold War is impossible to say with certainty. The forces that brought down the Soviet Union were complex and multifaceted. But Alexander's defection was certainly part of the broader pattern of revelations that exposed the gap between Soviet propaganda and Soviet reality. Each defector, each spy, each leaked document contributed to a growing understanding in the West that the Soviet military machine was not 10 feet tall. The story of the MiG-29's night blindness also reveals important lessons about how military technology is developed and deployed. The Soviet design philosophy prioritized raw performance, aerodynamic capability, and weapons load over systems integration and pilot interface. They built an aircraft that was impressive in an airshow or a daylight dogfight, but limited in the kind of complex all-weather, around-the-clock operations that modern air warfare requires. Western designers, by contrast, had increasingly focused on giving their pilots superior situational awareness. They invested heavily in radar technology, cockpit displays, and data links that allowed pilots to build a comprehensive picture of the battle space around them. The aircraft itself was important, but equally important was the information environment in which it operated. This philosophical difference reflected deeper contrast between the Soviet and Western approaches to military technology. The Soviet system, with its emphasis on central control and its distrust of individual initiative, naturally produced aircraft that required constant guidance from ground controllers. Western systems, which valued pilot autonomy and flexibility, produced aircraft that could operate independently and make tactical decisions on the fly. The MiG-29's limitations were not the result of incompetent engineering. Soviet aircraft designers were highly talented, and the MiG-29's aerodynamic design was genuinely excellent. But they were working within a system that constrained their choices in ways that ultimately proved counterproductive. The same centralized decision-making that prevented pilots from learning from each other's experiences also prevented designers from getting accurate feedback about how their aircraft performed in operational conditions. In the years since the end of the Cold War, Russia has developed improved variants of the MiG-29 that address many of the limitations Alexander revealed. The MiG-29 SMT and MiG-35 feature upgraded avionics, modern cockpit displays, and genuine night fighting capability. These improvements came too late to matter in the Cold War confrontation, but demonstrate that the fundamental design had potential that was never fully realized in its original form. Alexander Zuyev lived in the United States for many years after his defection. He struggled at times to adapt to his new life, as many defectors do. The trauma of leaving everything behind, combined with the ongoing threat of Soviet and later Russian retaliation, took a psychological toll. But he never expressed regret for his decision. He believed he had done the right thing, and the subsequent course of history seemed to validate that belief. His story became part of the broader narrative of Cold War defections, joining the tales of other pilots and soldiers and intelligence officers who chose to abandon the Soviet system. Each of these defections contributed to the West's understanding of Soviet capabilities and intentions. Collectively, they helped shape the policies and strategies that ultimately prevailed in the Cold War. The intelligence community has often referred to defectors as the most valuable source of information during the Cold War. While satellite imagery and signals intelligence could reveal the existence and location of military systems, only defectors could provide the kind of detailed operational knowledge that truly illuminated an adversary's capabilities. Alexander's information about the MiG-29's night blindness was exactly this kind of irreplaceable insight. For 12 years, from his defection in 1989 until the early 2000s, when the information became widely known, NATO exploited the intelligence Alexander provided. It influenced training programs, weapons development, tactics development, and operational planning. It gave Western military planners confidence that they could achieve air superiority against Soviet and Russian aircraft, a confidence that proved justified in the conflicts where that theory was tested. The story of Alexander Zuyev and the MiG-29's night blindness is ultimately a story about truth and deception, about courage and conscience, about the gap between appearance and reality. The Soviet Union projected an image of military strength that intimidated the world for decades, but behind that image were systems that didn't work as advertised, equipment that couldn't perform as claimed, and a fundamental dishonesty that ultimately contributed to the system's collapse. One man's decision to reveal the truth did not end the Cold War or bring down the Soviet Union. But it did demonstrate that the emperor had no clothes, that the fearsome MiG-29 was not quite as fearsome as it appeared, that the Soviet military machine was not the unstoppable force that propaganda portrayed. In a world where perception often matters as much as reality, that revelation had consequences that extended far beyond the technical specifications of a fighter aircraft. Today, decades after Alexander's defection, the MiG-29 remains in service with air forces around the world. It has been upgraded and improved, and modern variants are genuinely capable night fighters. But the original design, the aircraft that Alexander flew to freedom that May morning in 1989, will always be remembered as the fighter that couldn't see in the dark. The story continues to resonate because it speaks to universal themes: the courage required to leave everything familiar behind, the moral weight of keeping secrets versus revealing truths, the gap between what powerful institutions claim and what they can actually deliver. These themes transcend the specific Cold War context and remain relevant today. For military analysts, the story of the MiG-29's night blindness serves as a reminder that capabilities should never be assumed. Intelligence services must always seek to verify claims and test assumptions. An adversary's propaganda should be viewed skeptically, but so should one's own. The truth about military capabilities usually lies somewhere between the worst-case scenarios that justify larger budgets and the best-case scenarios that politicians prefer. For engineers and designers, the story illustrates the importance of systems thinking. An aircraft or any complex system is more than the sum of its components. The MiG-29 had excellent engines, impressive aerodynamics, and capable weapons. But the integration of these components into a coherent whole that pilots could use effectively in all conditions was where the design fell short. For ordinary people, the story of Alexander Zuyev offers a reminder that individuals can make a difference, even against the largest institutions. One pilot, acting on his conscience, changed the course of military history. His information shaped policies and strategies that affected millions of lives. In a world that often feels dominated by impersonal forces and vast bureaucracies, such stories of individual agency offer hope. The Cold War is now history, studied in textbooks and commemorated in museums. The Soviet Union exists only in memory. But the lessons of that era remain relevant, and the story of the MiG-29's night blindness continues to be told. It's a story about technology and tactics, about espionage and aviation. But ultimately, it's a story about one man who decided that truth was worth risking everything for. As we look at the world today, with its new tensions and new technologies, we can draw lessons from Alexander's story. Secrecy and deception may provide short-term advantages, but they often conceal weaknesses that eventually prove decisive. Honesty and transparency, while sometimes painful, tend to produce better outcomes in the long run. And courage, the willingness to take risks for what one believes is right, remains the most valuable and most rare human quality. The night sky that Alexander flew through on his way to freedom was the same sky that Soviet radar operators failed to adequately cover. It was the same sky where NATO pilots would later dominate, using the intelligence he provided. And it's the same sky that continues to be contested today, with new aircraft and new technologies, but the same fundamental questions about capability and vulnerability, truth and deception, courage and consequence. Alexander Zuyev's flight to freedom lasted less than 20 minutes, but its impact lasted for decades, and its lessons endure still. The MiG-29's night blindness was more than a technical limitation. It was a symbol of a system that could not see its own weaknesses, could not admit its own failures, and ultimately could not survive in a world where truth has a way of coming to light. In the end, the most advanced fighter aircraft is only as good as the system that designs it, builds it, maintains it, and flies it. The MiG-29 was a product of a system that prioritized appearance over substance, that punished honesty and rewarded deception, that demanded loyalty but did not earn it. When Alexander climbed into that cockpit on a dark May night, he carried with him not just his own disillusionment, but the accumulated frustrations of countless Soviet officers who knew the truth but could not speak it. His defection gave voice to that truth. It revealed what many suspected but could not prove, and it changed the balance of power in ways that are still being analyzed today. The MiG-29's night blindness was a metaphor for a larger blindness, an inability to see reality. Clearly, that ultimately doomed the Soviet experiment. Today, when we look at military systems being developed around the world, we should remember Alexander's story. We should ask whether the claimed capabilities match the actual performance. We should consider whether the people operating these systems can speak honestly about their limitations. And we should remember that the most dangerous blindness is not the inability to see in the dark, but the refusal to see what is plainly visible in the light. The story of the defecting Soviet pilot and the MiG-29's night blindness is ultimately a story about seeing clearly. Alexander saw the truth about his aircraft and his country, and he had the courage to act on what he saw. NATO analysts saw the opportunity that his defection presented, and they exploited it for more than a decade. And history has shown us the ultimate truth, that systems built on deception cannot stand, that lies eventually collapse under their own weight, and that courage and honesty, while often costly, are the only foundations for lasting success. That May night in 1989, when a young Soviet pilot flew toward freedom through a sky that his own Air Force could barely see, marked a turning point in military aviation history. But more than that, it marked a moment when one individual's moral courage intersected with great historical forces to produce consequences that neither he nor anyone else could have fully anticipated. In that intersection lies the essence of history itself, the way that personal choices and structural forces combine to create outcomes that shape the world. The MiG-29 continues to fly today, upgraded and improved, its original limitations addressed by new technology. Alexander Zuyev's act of courage is now decades in the past, part of a Cold War that younger generations know only from history books. But the lessons endure: the importance of truth, the value of courage, the danger of systems that cannot see their own weaknesses, and the enduring human capacity to choose what is right even when that choice costs everything. As we conclude this story, we should remember that history is not just about the great forces and vast armies that textbooks describe. It's also about individuals, people like Alexander Zuyev, who make choices that alter the course of events. The MiG-29's night blindness mattered because one man decided to reveal it. The intelligence shaped Western strategy because analysts and planners took it seriously. And the story continues to be told because it speaks to something fundamental about human nature and human society. In a world that often seems dominated by technology and institutions, Alexander's story reminds us that individuals still matter. One pilot in one cockpit on one dark night changed history. That possibility, the possibility that our choices matter, that our courage can make a difference, is perhaps the most important lesson of all. The night sky over Georgia. That May morning in 1989 was dark, but not as dark as the future that the Soviet system was building for itself. Alexander flew toward the light, toward freedom, toward truth, and in doing so, he illuminated a darkness that the most advanced Soviet fighter could not penetrate. The MiG-29's night blindness was revealed not by technology or espionage, but by one man's decision to see clearly and act accordingly. That is the power of truth. That is the value of courage, and that is why, more than 30 years later, we still tell the story of the defecting Soviet pilot who revealed that the fearsome MiG-29 could not see in the dark. The implications of this revelation extended into realms that Alexander himself might never have anticipated. The confidence that NATO gained from understanding the MiG-29's true capabilities influenced not just military planning, but diplomatic negotiations as well. When Western leaders sat across the table from their Soviet counterparts, they did so with knowledge that the Soviet military threat was not quite as overwhelming as it appeared. This knowledge subtly shifted the balance of power in countless negotiations and confrontations. The Soviet leadership, unaware of exactly what the West knew, continued to rely on the deterrent effect of their military power. But that deterrent effect was partially illusory, based on capability that existed more in propaganda than in reality. The psychological dimension of this intelligence advantage is often overlooked. Western military planners, armed with detailed knowledge of Soviet limitations, developed a confidence that influenced their recommendations and decisions. They knew that in a conflict, NATO forces would have significant advantages, particularly during night operations. This knowledge made Western leaders more willing to stand firm in confrontations, knowing that the ultimate military balance favored them more than public assessments suggested. Conversely, the Soviet leadership operated under a misapprehension about their own capabilities. They believed their MiG-29 force provided a level of air defense capability that it could not actually deliver. This false confidence may have influenced their own calculations and decisions in ways that contributed to the miscalculations that ultimately helped bring down the Soviet system. The intelligence from Alexander's defection also had significant implications for Western weapons development. Knowing exactly how the N-019 radar worked, what its vulnerabilities were, and how Soviet pilots were trained to use it allowed Western engineers to develop countermeasures with unprecedented precision. Electronic warfare systems were optimized to exploit specific weaknesses. Tactics were developed to maximize the advantage of superior night fighting capability. The F-117 stealth fighter, which was being deployed during the same period, benefited from this intelligence. Knowing that Soviet radar systems had significant blind spots and limitations allowed mission planners to develop attack profiles that minimized the risk to these valuable aircraft. The success of stealth technology in the Gulf War and subsequent conflicts owed something to the detailed understanding of Soviet radar capabilities that defectors like Alexander had provided. Training programs for Western pilots were also revised based on this intelligence. Air combat exercises began to incorporate more night operations, taking advantage of the known Soviet weakness. Pilots practiced low-light tactics and learned to exploit the situational awareness advantages their aircraft provided. When these pilots eventually faced Soviet-built aircraft in combat, they were prepared to maximize their advantages. The story of the MiG-29's night blindness also illustrates broader truths about military technology and the societies that produce it. The Soviet system, with its emphasis on centralized control and ideological conformity, produced aircraft that were powerful but inflexible. Western systems, with their emphasis on individual initiative and adaptive learning, produced aircraft that gave pilots the tools to succeed in complex, rapidly changing combat environments. This difference reflected deeper philosophical contrasts between the two systems. The Soviet approach trusted the system over the individual. Ground controllers were expected to manage air battles, with pilots serving essentially as weapons platforms to be directed from below. The Western approach trusted the individual pilot, providing tools and training that enabled autonomous decision-making in the heat of combat. These philosophical differences produced concrete tactical differences. Soviet pilots, trained to follow orders and maintain radio discipline, were often slow to react to unexpected situations. Western pilots, trained to think independently and act decisively, could adapt more quickly to changing circumstances. In the fast-paced environment of modern air combat, where decisions must be made in seconds, this adaptability proved decisive. The MiG-29's night blindness was a symptom of this broader systemic limitation. The Soviet system could not produce an aircraft designed for autonomous night operations because the Soviet military did not want pilots operating autonomously at night. The technology reflected the values of the system that created it. Understanding this connection helps explain why Soviet attempts to address the MiG-29's limitations often fell short. They could improve the radar and add new cockpit displays, but they could not easily change the underlying training and tactical philosophy that shaped how the aircraft would be used. The hardware could be upgraded, but the human factors remained rooted in a system that prioritized control over capability. This lesson remains relevant today as military planners around the world develop new technologies and doctrines. The most advanced weapons systems are only as effective as the people who operate them and the organizations that deploy them. A sophisticated aircraft flown by poorly trained pilots or constrained by rigid tactical doctrine will underperform against simpler systems operated by well-trained, adaptable forces. The story of Alexander Zuyev and the MiG-29 also speaks to the enduring importance of human intelligence in an age increasingly dominated by technical collection methods. Satellites and signals intercepts can reveal much about an adversary's capabilities, but they cannot reveal how those capabilities are actually used in practice. Only human sources, people who have operated the systems and lived within the organization, can provide that kind of operational insight. Alexander's information about training procedures, tactical doctrine, and pilot experiences was at least as valuable as the technical data about the aircraft itself. He could explain not just what the MiG-29 could theoretically do, but what Soviet pilots actually did with it in practice. This operational intelligence proved crucial for developing effective counter-tactics. The intelligence community has long recognized this distinction between capability and employment. An adversary may possess a powerful weapon, but how they train to use it, what doctrine governs its deployment, and how individual operators actually behave in practice can vary significantly from what technical analysis alone would suggest. Human intelligence fills these gaps in ways that no other collection method can match. Alexander's defection came at a particularly significant moment in history. The Soviet Union was in its final years, though no one knew it at the time. The reforms initiated by Gorbachev were unleashing forces that would ultimately tear the country apart. Alexander's disillusionment reflected a broader crisis of faith in the Soviet system that was spreading throughout Soviet society. His decision to defect was part of this larger pattern of dissolution. As more and more Soviet citizens lost faith in their system, the bonds that held the country together weakened. Each defection, each revelation of the gap between propaganda and reality contributed to this erosion. Alexander's flight was both a personal act of courage and a symptom of systemic decay. The timing also meant that the intelligence he provided would be used not in the Great War that both sides had long prepared for, but in a series of smaller conflicts where Soviet-built equipment faced Western forces. The Gulf War, the Balkans conflicts, and subsequent engagements would test the lessons learned from Alexander's defection. In each case, the predictions based on his information proved accurate. Western forces dominated against Soviet-built aircraft, particularly in conditions where superior night fighting capability and beyond visual range systems could be exploited. These combat results validated not just the specific intelligence about the MiG-29, but the broader analytical framework that NATO had developed based on defector information. The Soviet military machine, it turned out, was exactly as flawed as the defectors had claimed. The equipment performed as they had described. The tactics proved ineffective against Western countermeasures. The mighty Soviet bear, it seemed, had been a paper tiger all along. This revelation had significant psychological effects within the military establishments of countries that had relied on Soviet equipment. For decades, client states had purchased Soviet weapons based on claims of capability that were never independently verified. Now those claims were being tested in combat, and the results were often disappointing. Countries that had built their defense strategies around Soviet equipment began to reconsider their options. The perception of Soviet military invincibility, carefully cultivated over decades, collapsed remarkably quickly once the evidence began to accumulate. What had seemed like a fearsome threat was revealed to be significantly less capable than advertised. This shift in perception had geopolitical consequences that extended far beyond the purely military realm. The story of Alexander Zuyev and the MiG-29's night blindness thus connects to some of the most significant historical developments of the late 20th century. The end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the military conflicts of the 1990s, and the reshaping of the global order all intersected with the intelligence that one defecting pilot provided. Of course, Alexander's information was only one thread in a complex tapestry. The Cold War ended for many reasons, most of which had nothing to do with the MiG-29's radar limitations, but the intelligence he provided contributed to the confidence with which Western leaders approached the endgame of the superpower confrontation. And the combat results that validated his information shaped the post-Cold War world in ways that continue to influence global politics today. As we reflect on this story, we should remember that history rarely unfolds in predictable ways. When Alexander climbed into that MiG-29 cockpit on a dark night in May 1989, he could not have known that the Berlin Wall would fall 5 months later. He could not have predicted that the Soviet Union would collapse within 3 years. And he certainly could not have foreseen how the intelligence he carried to the West would be used in conflicts he had never imagined. Yet his act of courage mattered. The information he provided shaped events in ways large and small. His story became part of the larger narrative of the Cold War's end. And his legacy endures in the lessons we can draw from his experience. The MiG-29's night blindness was a technical limitation, but the story of its revelation is fundamentally human. It is about courage and conscience, about truth and deception, about individuals and systems. It reminds us that behind every weapon system are the people who design it, build it, operate it, and sometimes betray it. Their stories matter as much as the technical specifications. In telling this story, we honor not just Alexander Zuyev, but all those who, throughout history, have chosen truth over loyalty to corrupt systems. Their acts of courage often go unrecognized, their contributions unacknowledged, but history has shown time and again that such acts matter. They change outcomes, they shape events, they remind us that individuals can make a difference even against the most powerful forces. The sky over Georgia on that May night in 1989 was dark, but one man flew toward the light. The MiG-29 could not see in the dark, but Alexander Zuyev saw clearly enough to know what he had to do. And in doing so, he became part of a story far larger than himself, a story about the end of an empire, the exposure of a deception, and the enduring power of truth. That story continues to be told because it matters. It matters for what it reveals about the Cold War and its end. It matters for what it teaches about military technology and the societies that create it. And it matters for what it says about the human capacity for courage, for conscience, and for seeing clearly when all around is darkness. The MiG-29's night blindness was revealed more than 3 decades ago, but its lessons remain relevant today. In a world of competing great powers, of advanced technologies, and of conflicting narratives about capability and intent, the importance of seeing clearly has never been greater. Alexander's story reminds us that truth has a way of emerging, that deceptions eventually collapse, and that courage in pursuit of what is right remains the most valuable and most rare of human qualities. As we face the challenges of our own time, we would do well to remember the defecting Soviet pilot who revealed that the fearsome MiG-29 could not see in the dark. His story is both a historical account and a moral lesson, both a tale of Cold War espionage and a meditation on the nature of truth and courage. It deserves to be remembered, studied, and understood, for it has much to teach us about the world we have inherited and the choices we must make to navigate it. The night sky that Alexander crossed on his way to freedom was the same sky that has witnessed countless acts of courage and countless moments of cowardice throughout human history. What makes some people choose the harder right over the easier wrong remains one of the great mysteries of human nature. But we can celebrate those who make that choice, learn from their example, and strive to emulate their courage when our own moments of decision arrive. Alexander Zuyev made his choice on a dark night in May 1989. The consequences of that choice rippled outward in ways he could never have imagined, touching military strategy and diplomatic negotiations, weapons development and combat operations, the fate of nations and the lives of countless individuals. In making that choice, he proved that one person can indeed make a difference, that courage matters, and that truth has a power that no amount of deception can ultimately withstand. That is the enduring legacy of the defecting Soviet pilot who revealed the MiG-29's night blindness. That is why we tell this story, more than 30 years after it happened. And that is why it continues to resonate with audiences who may never fly an aircraft, never face such a choice, but who understand on some fundamental level that courage and truth are values worth celebrating and defending. The MiG-29 could not see in the dark, but Alexander Zuyev saw clearly enough to change history. And in doing so, he left us a story that illuminates not just the past, but the path we must walk into the future.